The role of women, ever since the beginning of time, has remained something of inferiority and dependency upon men. Even as Europe neared the late 19th century, women remained economically dependent and legally inferior to their male counterparts, despite their social classes. Often women in the 19th century had no choice other than to remain under the mandate of men and often lived in a state no better than slavery. They were forced to obey men because the men were the ones with the income and all the other resources upon which the women were dependent, because they held no individual sustenance. Women could have no children or cohabit with a man, for the social penalties were simply too high. Nor could she follow a profession, since they were all close to women. Not only were aspects to social independence close to women, but even social and domestic equalities were shut. Even in the mid-19th century, virtually all European women faced social and legal disabilities. These complications were unfailingly present in three particular areas. They were property rights, family law, and education. And no matter what the social class the women were from, they were not allowed to have property under their name. A woman's property would be under her husband's name.
Until the last quarter of the 19th century, married women could not in their own rights own property. Women lost to their husbands' control any property they owned, or might even possibly inherit, or even earn by labor.
The ignorance women received from the law was increasingly appalling. Women had no independent standing before the law. The court saw the theft of a woman's property as a theft of her husband's property. Even when a woman's possession is stolen, it is considered that a man's property is stolen.
Mon mari, il est mort. Il y a 4 ans.
My husband, he died 4 years ago. He left me with 4 daughters and a good, decent fortune. We could have survived. We could have easily survived. We had good land, but I was a woman, and because I had only daughters, we lost it all. We lost it all.
For a long time, the woman's situation remained unchanged. A married woman's legal possessions would be subsumed their husband's name. They virtually did not have any legal identity. All possessions of women were their husband's. Reform finally took place in 1882 when the Married Women's Property Act was passed. This allowed for women to have property under their name. Family law played a great deal of influence on these women as well. Women were required to give their complete obedience to their spouse.
In Germany, women were given more freedom in 1895 when they were permitted to claim jobs without their husband's permission. French women were allowed to open personal savings accounts in 1895, and then finally in 1907, they were given possession of their wages.
The wages and earnings of any married woman acquired or gained by her after the passing of this act in any employment, occupation, or trade shall be deemed and taken to be property held and settled to her separate use, and her receipts alone shall be a good discharge for such wages, earnings, money, and property.
Throughout the 19th century, women had less access to education than men did, and whatever was available to them could scarcely be considered sufficient, and was dramatically superior to the resources deposited to men. Not surprisingly, the results of this lack of education were the scarcity of literate women.
Absence of a private or even public system of education for women prevented them from gaining the qualifications that would later allow them to get jobs and earn any pension they could. And this caused a very big wave of disruption within the European societies as women flocked to the streets and to vulgar professions.
The discrimination displayed is atrocious. The extremely sexist men did not care to show any respect or humility to the women. In fact, university professors and the members of the top branches of professional education frankly stated that they would not teach women.
Women were increasingly disrespected within this era. Inside their homes and out, women were seen only as instruments of sexual pleasure. Every man had the right to force his wife into sex and childbirth. He could take her children without reason and send them to be raised elsewhere. He could spend his wife's inheritance on a mistress or on prostitutes. Throughout all of Europe, such violations and a great many more took place.
One of the greatest examples of women who suffered domestic suppression is Susanna Palmer, who escaped from her adulterous husband in 1869 after suffering many years of brutal beatings and made a new life. She worked, saved, and created a new home for her children.
Later, when Sarah Palmer's husband found her, stripped her of all of her possessions, and left her to stoop with the blessing of the law, in a fury she stabbed him and was immediately prosecuted. If a woman was unhappy with her situation, there was, almost without exception, nothing she could do about it. Except in extremely rare cases, a woman could not obtain a divorce, and until 1891, if she ran away from an intolerable, the police could capture and return her, and her husband would imprison her. All of this was sanctioned by church, law, custom, history, and approved by society in general. It was not the result of ancient, outdated laws.
The new Divorce Act of 1857 restated and re-established the moral inequalities within a domestic household. Mere adultery was not grounds for a woman to divorce a man. However, it was sufficient grounds for a man to divorce his wife. The discrimination was astounding. It was just not legitimate. It wasn't, on no grounds whatsoever.
The major issues about the sexual and reproductive rights of women could hardly be discussed in the 19th century. The laws surrounding rape normally even took action to the disadvantage of women. However, in situations as grim as these, women found ways to bourgeois. As 19th century Britain was evolving, the family economy was replaced by a new patriarchy, which saw women moving from small, safe worlds of family workshops or home-based businesses to larger-scale sweatshops and factories. The expansion of these large businesses resulted in more job opportunities for women. Inventions such as telephone and typewriter opened employment for women such as clerks, secretaries, and shop assistants. Elementary school teachers grew greatly as well.
I'm very grateful that our society has opened up such job opportunities for women such as myself. I find myself more independent. No matter how much the law, the government suppresses me, I know that I am capable of standing on my own 2 feet, of supporting my children and putting bread on the table. No matter that it all goes to my husband, it's extremely reassuring to know that even after he is gone, I will still be there. Will be able to keep my children's stomachs full.
Women played a relatively small part in the workforce of 19th century Europe. Most working women were unmarried or widows, and they worked unskilled jobs. Those who had family were often unwanted as workers because employers expected that work would be interfered with by their personal family responsibilities. However, working women who got married or started a family often ended up resigning in order to take care of their children. By the end of the 19th century, women who did work remained at home in order to bring in a second income.
Jobs for women mostly required low-level skills involving minimal training. Such occupations were mostly taken up by unmarried women or widows because employers didn't want workers' family responsibilities to interfere with their work. Women received low wages due to the understanding that women's jobs were in addition to their spouses. This unfortunately hurt widows and single women. Upon marriage or after childbirth, women usually withdrew from the labor force.
Even though the wages were unfairly distributed within labor forces, in the favor of men of course, many women still tolerated what they got because in the end, they needed every penny they could make. Rarely ever did they complain. I can't imagine that they ever did.
The system of manufacturing radically changed the working system. Now, mass-made clothes of corresponding sizes were designed to require minimum skill from the laborers.
The putting out system introduced itself around this point in the century. As so many workers entered the field, the manufacturer developed this almost machine-like system that proved to be very beneficial for the industry.
There were a great number of families found the need for a second income to support themselves in 19th century Europe. This changed as reforms were made in favor of the working class. As health conditions in factories were bettered, less men died, keeping women from being forced to work to support their families. Wages were increased and family size decreased, so there was even less of a need for the women to work. Even if additional family members had to work, they worked much less than before. Essentially, what happened was that the reforms that directly affected the mostly male workers also aided the women and the children.
As with men, women's experiences reflected their class, but women of all classes were treated as men's inferiors in property rights, family law, and education.
Even in the mid-19th century, virtually all European women faced social and legal disabilities.
Nous avons tout perdu! Nous avons tout perdu!
Even though the wages were unfairly distributed within labor forces, in the favor of men of course, many women still tolerated what they got because in the end, they needed every penny they could make. Rarely ever did they complain. I can't imagine that they ever did.
The Second Industrial Revolution opened more jobs to women and simultaneously witnessed the withdrawal of married women from the workforce. Family law often required women's obedience to their husbands, and women's education was minimum and inferior, for men feared professional competition from women.
And this caused a great wave of disruption within the European societies.
These changes eventually led to the questions about the adequacy in the 19th century petty bourgeoisie lifestyle, which in due course shaped the future of women's rights, equalities, and later disabilities.